Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 8 through 25, verse 4. We are going through the law, and one of the, I think, most helpful ways for us to study the law is to see the law as representing or expounding on the Ten Commandments. There are some things that may be a little bit feel out of place in places, but I think that we can definitely see this as a pattern throughout the law, and it certainly helps us as we study to be able to kind of have an outline, and the Ten Commandments give us, I think, an excellent outline of the law here. And so, as Moses, again, I'll just repeat that you may be getting tired of hearing this, but we're almost done with the book of Deuteronomy. So, as Moses has led the children of Israel through the wilderness, obviously first delivering them with God's power from Egypt, from slavery in Egypt, and then they received the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai. And then they wandered in the wilderness because the generation that came out of Egypt chose not to obey God and go in and conquer the land. They doubted God's power. They chose not to go in and take over the land at that time. And so as a result, they were going to be punished, and that generation would die off before they entered the land, except for two of the spies that were faithful and advised Moses that they should go in, and those were, of course, Joshua and Caleb. And so now here they are after 40 years from leaving Egypt, and they're standing just ready, poised to go into the land, and Moses is making sure that the second generation after being delivered from Egypt is fully aware of the law. And so this is a second telling of the law. Deuteronomy literally means the second law, the second telling of the law. The first was, of course, in Exodus. And we do find that this telling is somewhat more abbreviated, and there are some slight differences in terms of maybe it's just the way Moses expressed it. Maybe it's what God wanted the people to take away. We saw that in the Ten Commandments in particular, when he said, honor thy father and thy mother, and he talked about, why. And in Exodus, now I'm going to have trouble. He talked about it was the Sabbath. I got confused. I'm sorry. It was the Sabbath, and he said, because of the creation, the 7 days of creation, God worked for 6 days and then he rested. But in Deuteronomy, he gives a different reason, and it now I'm just, I didn't have this written down, and so now I'm just going to completely space. But it wasn't about the creation. It was about. I'm just going to completely space. My apologies. It was focused on the worship of God. Wasn't focused on the resting, was focused on the worship. Oh, I know. He said he was pointing back to because you were delivered from Egypt. And so, at any rate, I just kind of completely went off on a bunny trail before I even got started this morning. So this morning, we're in the section of the law that's expounding the 9th commandment, and that is, thou shalt not bear false witness, prohibiting the false witness. We would say lying as to generalize it. And in this passage, what we're going to see is that this is interpreted much more broadly than simply not bearing false witness, which would maybe give the impression of standing up in court and testifying and bearing false witness against someone. We're going to see that there's a much broader application to this. Really looking more at how we conduct ourselves with our I'll say family, but this is talking about Israel and how they conducted themselves with their fellow Israelites, that they would conduct themselves fairly, equitably toward both the possessions and the dignity of their fellow Israelites, even including convicted criminals. and domestic animals, he goes on to show here. So it's more than just not bear false witness. It's really how we treat one another in general. So let's begin, and we're going to pause as we go through. It's not that long of a passage, but I think it's helpful for us to kind of pause and make sure that we understand how each section applies, what he's saying and how it applies here. Beginning in verse 8 of chapter 24, he says, "Take care in a case of leprous disease to be very careful to do according to all that the Levitical priests shall direct you. As I commanded them, so shall you be careful to do. Remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam on the way as you came out of Egypt." Now, this one certainly doesn't sound like it has anything to do with not bearing false witness, but then in verse 9 there, when he says, remember what happened to Miriam, what did the Lord do to Miriam? Well, this comes from a little incident back in Numbers, and we're not going to turn to it or read it for sake of time this morning, and this one was one that maybe you're not familiar with. I wasn't as familiar with it as I studied this week as I maybe should have been. Maybe I just have forgotten it. Basically, this was a time when Miriam and Aaron were talking, and now the account in Numbers is, I think, a little bit vague on exactly what happened, but this verse seems to imply that it was Miriam that said to Aaron, why are we having to listen to Moses? Why is it that Moses is the one that is, God's messenger? And then she goes on, she says, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? So she was saying, here we are, Moses is going around, telling God's law, or God, telling people what to do, and, bringing God's message to the people. Well, hasn't God also spoken through us, she says? Of course, this really wasn't true. This was a falsehood. And in that story, or that account, God called out Miriam and Aaron. And he said, go get Moses and go to the tent of meeting, that place where God would meet with Moses. But in this case, Miriam and Aaron were there. He called them out. And essentially, he reminded them that though he did reveal himself at times through dreams and visions to other people, he said that Moses was his chosen servant. It was Moses that met with God face to face, if you'll remember the account on Mount Sinai. And Moses, who asked God if he could see God, he made that request. And while God didn't allow him to directly see his face, he did allow, he passed by, and then he allowed Moses to see what we call his afterglory. I don't know, or what Scripture calls his afterglory. We're not exactly sure what that means. But God reminds them, that Moses was the one who met with God, who is he's special. And he even says that Moses beholds the form of the Lord. The rest of the people, were spoken to maybe in visions and dreams, but Moses directly met with the Lord. He was chosen for that purpose. And then he says, why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? In Numbers, this is still in the Numbers account. And then he proceeds to give Miriam leprosy. And that's the link to this command to follow the Levitical priests, and it's not so much just when they have leprosy, but this was the link in their, so that they would remember this account of what happened to Miriam, because she bore false witness against Moses. She spoke out against him. And so, as it turns out, Moses was, don't give her leprosy. He pled to the Lord, don't give her leprosy. And he said, for 7 days, she can be outside the camp until she's clean. She needs to obey the Levite, the Levitical process, the priests. She needs to obey that, just like anybody else who would have leprosy. And so it's interesting because Moses, if you'll remember, was from the tribe of Levi. Aaron was the first priest. And so, this was like the line of the Levites in a sense. And the Levites, in fact, what was their job but to, tell the people of the law and to enforce the law, to implement the law, essentially, to carry out these, sacrifices and cleansings. And in the case of leprosy, there were specific things in the law that they had to do. And so, God was using this 7 days in time out for Miriam to be reminded, yes, that, the Levites, because of Moses, they're like his successors in a sense. God gave the law to Moses, and so hence we're, met with this command, or the Israelites are met with this command to take care. And I find it interesting, he says this word care twice in this verse. Take care, in a case of leprous disease, to be very careful to do according to all the Levitical priests shall direct you. And so this was, a hearkening back to Miriam bearing false witness against Moses. Now we move on to verse 10, where he's going to talk about debtors. He says, when you make your neighbor a loan of any sort, you shall not go into his house to collect his pledge. You shall stand outside, and the man to whom you make the loan shall bring the pledge out to you. And if he is a poor man, you shall not sleep in his pledge. You shall restore to him the pledge as the sun sets, that he may sleep in his cloak and bless you. And it shall be righteousness for you before the Lord your God. Now this also is a little bit strange to us because, we go to a bank and get a loan. We don't, and we don't have like collateral that they come into our house and collect collateral. That's not the way it works today. But in this day, when you, it was a personal loan, as we might call it. And so there was collateral. We talked about this last week. But this applies again, it's a kind of an overlapping with last week's law. But this is, if he makes a pledge, you don't go into his house and collect the pledge. You're respecting his home. You're respecting his dignity. You're letting him bring the collateral out to you. And if in particular, now this section gets a little bit kind of, again, a little, we may not understand very well. He says, for the poor man, what do you do? Well, poor man doesn't have much to give as a collateral, as a pledge. And so it may have been common to give his cloak or his coat, his covering, because that might have been all he had. Depends on how poor he was. In any case, whatever it is he had for collateral, he was poor. And so what does he have except his necessities? And so basically he's saying, don't deprive him of his necessities. And in this case, he's talking about the cloak. I think this is more of an example than an actual literal letter of the law. But if he has a cloak and he gives it for a pledge, you don't want to keep that. He's going to get cold at night. You need to do what's right, what's equitable, what's fair. You need to, when the sun sets, return his cloak to him. Well, that's kind of interesting because he may not even have repaid his debt yet. So it's not much of collateral, is it? But basically he wants us, this stretches the command to not bear false witness beyond simply, speaking falsehood, but into treating people right, treating them with dignity, respecting them, honoring them, having compassion. And then he says, well, I find it interesting. He says, he will bless you. He will have his cloak to sleep and he will bless you. This is, if you're kind to someone, generally speaking, they appreciate it. It creates an atmosphere, a relationship of goodwill. And then he goes on, he says, and it shall be righteousness for you before the Lord your God. Obviously, the opposite of righteousness there would be, if you're being, you remember Jesus talked about the master, the cruel master, the one who he had owed another master money, and this master forgave him his debt, or at least gave him more time to pay it. But then someone owed him money, and he was cruel, and he demanded payment immediately. Well, Jesus is, not Jesus, God here through Moses is saying, not just to speak truth, but he's also saying to treat people with compassion, treat people well, treat people, maybe the golden rule, right? The golden rule, how you should treat people the way you want to be treated. So he goes on now and he talks about poor laborers. And maybe as we read this, maybe you'll have a picture of Ruth when she worked in the field of Boaz. And he says, you shall not oppress a hired worker who is poor and needy. Now, this is talking about a worker, and Ruth wasn't a worker. She was a sojourner in the land. She wasn't an Israelite, but she was in the land. And it says, you shall not oppress a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether he is one of your brothers or sisters, brothers or one of the sojourners who are in your land and within your towns. You shall give him his wages on the same day before the sun sets, for he is poor and counts on it, lest he cry against you to the Lord and you be guilty of sin. I goofed. The analogy for to Ruth is later on. So at any rate, you shall not oppress a hired worker who is poor and needy. So someone comes to work for you and they have needs. They need to eat. How often do we need to eat? I mean, if you go a full day without eating, you're probably going to be pretty hungry. Sometimes you might skip breakfast. I have a bad habit of skipping breakfast. It's not that big of a deal because I'm going to eat lunch. I don't think I've got any, fears of wasting away anytime soon. But you have a poor worker. He's come and worked for you, and he has needs. And so he says, you shall give him his wages on the same day before the sun sets. For he's poor. He needs it. He counts on those wages to live by. Made me think about, when I first got out of college and got a job, and somebody was asking me, what is their pay cycle? And it was twice a month. I've always been paid twice a month. And so this guy was telling me, well, a lot of companies pay just one time a month. And I was thinking, boy, that'd be kind of difficult, especially when you're first starting out. You just get paid one time a month and you got to wait the whole month to get paid again, and you might run out of money. Well, in this, he's talking here about the poor, and he's saying you need to pay them the same day. Because of why? He counts on it. Why? Because you need to be compassionate. I mean, he earned that money, but you recognize his need and you're compassionate. But he gives a warning. He says, lest he cry against you to the Lord and you be guilty of sin. I mean, he's earned his money. He's going to not maybe starve to death in one day, but, if you withheld his wages for a week and only paid him weekly, which is also very common, that's a little long. I mean, he might literally starve to death. Probably not, but you can't live that way. And so he even says you'll be guilty of, lest you be guilty of sin. So to deny the poor something they both deserve and they desperately need, he classifies as sin. Essentially, to not have that amount of compassion, that amount of, giving them that dignity of having, their money to be able to eat. Now, the thing is, each one of these are giving, I think, cases that the Israelites look at, but this is just one case. And Jesus shows us that in especially the Sermon on the Mount, where he takes these 10 commandments and he expands on them and shows us, it really means more than what you may have read as the letter of the law. And so we need to understand this applies to us more generally than just these specific examples. Well, now we come to a section, verse, he talks about children and parents, and this also seems somewhat out of place, but it does emphasize again the idea of fairness. He says in verse 16, and maybe this is particularly appropriate for our society today because we have this, idea that we can punish someone for what their ancestors did. He says, fathers shall not be put to death because of their children, nor shall children be put to death because of their fathers. Each one shall be put to death for his own sin. Well, if someone's going to be put to death, it's not going to be for someone else's sin. It's going to be for what they specifically do. Seems a little out of place, of course, but this, punishment, particularly he's referring here to capital punishment, should be applied to the one who commits the sin. You don't blame a father for the sins of his his children or his child. This could be a young child, but I would presume this is, referring to adult children. We have adult children and they make their own decisions, and we're not really responsible for the choices they make. We've taught them, we've trained them. Hopefully we have, and even if we haven't, ultimately they still bear responsibility for their own choices in life. And likewise, a child should not be, held responsible for what his father does. Maybe you've had that experience yourself or seen someone who has had that experience where, a father made poor choices, and it may have repercussions. In fact, it will have almost always repercussions on the future generations. And so he's saying you need to be fair in your application of justice. Don't, blame someone else. Don't use someone else's wrong against a person. Now he goes on. Now he's talking about resident aliens and widows and orphans. He says, you shall not pervert justice due to the sojourner or the fatherless, or take a widow's garment in a pledge, but you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore I command you to do this. Now he again refers back, and you see this throughout the law. He just wants Israel to keep in mind, you were slaves in Egypt. And God did what? He redeemed you out of slavery. He brought you out of slavery. And so, therefore, you shall not pervert justice. The idea here is that there are those who are defenseless in society. He talks about the resident alien, the sojourner, and they don't have family. This isn't their community. They're foreigners. And then there's widows and orphans. And, a widow, it was the man who had standing in society and could go before the, handle like situations where they needed to go make appeals to for justice. And women didn't have that standing. They couldn't just, they weren't represented in that way. And so as a widow, You had no representation. And of course, orphans didn't have parents to care for them. And so there were those who were, in a sense, defenseless. And so you don't want to allow the justice system to take advantage of those who are defenseless. And, you want to apply the law as it should be applied, but you don't want to take advantage. So you shall not pervert the justice due to the sojourner or the fatherless, or take a widow's garment in pledge, just as examples. So he goes on, and this really is a continuation in verse 19. He says, but when, he doesn't say but, I'm sorry. He says, when you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field. In other words, you're harvesting and things drop in the field. And in particular, of course, a sheaf is a bundle. You see these, we have Amish obviously in the area, and you see these bundles of corn usually in sheaves, and one is left in the field, something that you own, but it's left in the field. He says, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. This is where Ruth comes to mind, where she was in the field and in Boaz's field and able to collect what they had left behind. And what did Boaz do? You remember? He went to his workers and he said, drop a little extra so that Ruth can collect it. He had compassion, and he wanted her to have enough to care, to take care of herself and her family. He says, when you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over them again. Don't go back to them again. It shall be for the sojourner. Whatever olives don't fall off, leave them there so that the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow can come and take those. And when you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not strip it afterward. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I command you to do this. Now, obviously, God provided for them, but Egypt did feed the Israelites. I mean, they had food, but they were slaves in Egypt, and they were delivered. And God brought them to this land, and the land of flowing with milk and honey. This was a land of blessing. And so what he wanted them to do was to share their blessings, things they had been given. You have a field that you grow, corn or wheat or whatever it is, vineyard, an olive tree. You have those blessings. And so you are to share your blessings. The blessings have been shared with you. God shared his blessings with you. He's really given this to the people as a whole. The Israelites were not to be stingy as to make sure that the less fortunate couldn't share in their blessings. This was a community. There was a covenant community here, and all the members have rights to share in those blessings of the land that God had given them. Now he goes on to kind of another area, which we're kind of getting in, maybe decreasing, importance of the, or what we might think is a decreasing importance of the people involved. It doesn't mean that it's actually decreasing, but we go to the criminals. He says, if there is a dispute between men and they come into court and the judges decide between them, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty, then if the guilty man deserves to be beaten, in other words, if that is the punishment that is due him, the judge shall cause him to lie down and be beaten in his presence with a number of stripes in proportion to his offense. 40 stripes may be given him, but not more, lest if one should go on to beat him with more stripes than these, your brother be degraded in your sight. Now, I've heard people say that this had to do with if you gave them too many stripes that they actually might die. But that's not what he says here. That may be true, but he says, lest they be degraded in your sight. So here someone is guilty of something, and there's a punishment to be assigned. The thrust of the section, though, is that even though someone commits a crime, his punishment should not be excessive. The punishment should fit the crime. He says the number of stripes should be given in proportion to the offense. And there was this limit of stripes or beating as a punishment, and that limit was 40. Later on, the Israelites, just for fear that they would accidentally go over the limit of 40, they said, well, we're only going to give 39, then we don't have to worry if we counted wrong. And so then we see that reference made to Jesus receiving 39 stripes. That was the maximum amount of strikes that they could receive as a punishment. And so he received 39 stripes on our behalf before he was then crucified. But the idea here is treating them really, there's a dignity associated with this, lest he should be degraded in your eyes. We should treat people equitably, fairly. There's a sense of justice here that is important. And why? Well, the Israelites were treated a certain way by Egypt, but they were freed, they were redeemed. And so the fact they've been redeemed, and here they are, they're entering this land of blessings, and it applies the same sense of you've been given something, so you need to be fair and equitable to people that you work with. And then lastly, we come to this verse 4, and it's a very short verse, but it says, you shall not muzzle an ox when he is treading out the grain. And the ox would be used to trample the grain, to thresh it, trampling out in the process of really extracting the grain. And the idea here was that even the ox, even these domesticated animals, should not be muzzled while threshing the grain in order to prevent it from eating some of the grain. They would muzzle it to keep it from eating, but he said, don't do that. Don't muzzle it. Let it basically allow the ox to share in the fruit of his own labor, share in the blessings, if you will. And so, I think that just seeing the trend there of being concerned, even down to the point of animals, I think that's very telling of how of God's heart and how he wants us to live. So just like Jesus and I mentioned earlier in the Sermon on the Mount, showed us that commandments such as thou shalt not kill were really more like thou shalt not hate your brother. And commandments like thou shalt not commit adultery were meant more like thou shalt not look at a woman to lust after her. And here we see from this section that what God has in mind here is much more than don't bear false witness against someone. Thou shalt not bear false witnesses is really much more. It's something more like deal honestly and fairly with one another. Have respect and honor someone's dignity. Why is this really so important? Well, of course, we know that Jesus says I am the way, the truth, and the life. And so certainly we see he is truth. And as we are called to bear his image, we are to deal honestly, truthfully. But I think there's more to it than that. Jesus also said in John, by this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another. See, this idea of being fair and equitable, we wouldn't be that way if we didn't have love. This really is maybe the most directly linked to love your neighbor as yourself. These actions that God is giving in this law are directly linked to the idea of loving other people. You know, you will reflect the image of the invisible God by how you treat one another. If you treat each other out of love, fairly and honestly, respectfully, then you're reflecting Jesus' love. And see, in this way, the world around us, if we take this to heart and live this way, live fairly, honestly, equitably, people recognize that. They recognize when someone treats people fairly versus, you might know people who are ruthless, who don't care, don't love other people. And those are people, they stand out in your mind. You really don't want to have anything to do with them. But people who are always fair, always honest, always just, even to the point of not even just being just. I mean, think about the idea of justice. God is just, but he doesn't give us the punishment we deserve. Instead, that was given to Jesus. So we can even treat people in a way that maybe they don't even deserve to be, better than they deserve to be treated. And as we do this, the world around us observes this. They see this hope, really, the hope of glory. It's a hope that is in us because of what Jesus has done for us. That's how we treat other people. We should treat other people. So when they see that in us, then they will come and ask us. They don't always ask, but maybe someone at some point would come and say, why do you care so much? Why do you treat people so well, even when they may not even deserve to be treated that well? Well, it gives us an opportunity to tell them of the blessed hope that we have because someone has treated us well in spite of our sin. So that reminded of that verse that we quote so often, that we should, be ready always to give an answer to those who ask a reason for the hope that's in us, with meekness and fear. And I related a week or two ago that really the context of that is that we should live holy. We should live rightly. We should follow the commandments of Jesus. Jesus said, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. And so as we're doing that, then the way we're living is literally a testimony. And then that's followed up with spreading the gospel to those around us. So may we recognize ways in which we can love one another and love our neighbor as ourselves, treating people equitably, and see how that relates to living honestly and rightly in a world that is virtually devoid of fair treatment. I don't know if you're watching the news these days, but there's a lot of treatment that's not fair, that's not right. And so it doesn't really take that much for us to be different, does it? What we have to do is love people and be fair. Let's go before the throne.